Welcome to This Week in Heresy, episode 42, Santeria, Mystery, and Respect, with our guest via Skype, River Devora. Hi, River. Welcome to This Week in Heresy.
Hey, how you doing?
Good. So, for those who don't know who you are, could you please introduce yourself and tell people a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Sure. Let's see. I am a lot of things, and I do a lot of things. What is most applicable here? Well, I am a Githia and a Santera and a Seithkona, and I have a whole list of names that are in foreign languages that most people probably don't know what they mean. But basically, my two primary spiritual paths or religious paths are, I am a traditionally initiated Santera. I'm a daughter of Ochun. I initiated about 4 years ago, give or take, with a traditional house in San Francisco. And then I've also been involved in heathenry and in the broader pagan community for probably about 20 years now, give or take. I am teaching classes. I have a class that I'm running right now, helping people deepen into polytheism as a living tradition. And when I'm not doing spirity things, I also do some amount of one-on-one counseling and that kind of stuff. And I've been doing that for a long time. And, in my day job, I'm a mom and a nutritionist. So.
Excellent. So, we've had, Ember, but we've had her on before and she's talked about heathenry, but we haven't had anybody to talk about Santera. So could you explain a little bit for the people that wouldn't know what that is?
Santeria is an Afro-Cuban diasporic tradition. The tradition, as I understand it, is coming out of Cuba. It was a tradition that basically, as slaves were brought over to Cuba from Africa, there was a whole bunch of folks who did as much as they could to preserve their native religion. Where obviously there was an awful lot of very, very serious and dire consequences if they were discovered. And once Cuba became an independent country, once the slaves were freed, the religion kind of continued to grow and develop. It is unique to Cuba. There are related diasporic traditions, some of which are more similar or more different, but it's continued in Cuba. The Cuban Santeria has then kind of evolved and has spread out to other places. There's a pretty healthy pockets of community here in the United States. It is still a religion largely practiced in Spanish-speaking communities, although it's also been starting to make its way into other communities as well.
So what drew you to that tradition?
It's kind of a funny story.
Okay.
Actually, it wasn't necessarily a tradition that I went searching for at all. I'm from New York, and there is somewhat of a Santeria community there. And Santeria has always had kind of a bad reputation in certain ways in New York because it's been, people get very, very nervous. They think it's associated with devil worship and with, animal cruelty and right. Creepy, spooky kind of stuff. Definitely it's worth saying here and now that a lot of the stigma and bad reputation that Santeria ends up getting in part is because, let's face it, it's a community largely practiced by people of color, by immigrants. Mm-hmm. So the same kind of stuff that you may get from neo-pagan traditions or things being practiced primarily by white folks who are, whose families have been in the United States for longer, get somewhat of a pass, where Santeria often gets demonized even by neo-pagan practitioners who probably, in my opinion, should know better.
Right.
The way that I ended up in the tradition, if I'm to trace the story realistically all the way back, when I was probably, I don't know, about 11 years old and CDs had just become a thing. Mm-hmm. One of my first CDs was Babatunde Olatunji CD, which he's a Nigerian drummer. Mm-hmm. And the Orisha, who are the primary spirits in Santeria were originally West African spirits. There's an argument about whether you would call them deities or not. The way in my house, the way that we understand it is that they're not deities. There's only one deity, and Orisha are agents of that deity, kind of almost like angels. But anyway, I had this Babatunde Olatunji CD, and the last song on the album was a devotional song to Shango, who is the Orisha of thunder and lightning and all kinds of stuff. And so there would be my sister Jill and I, 9 and 11 years old, jumping up and down on the bed, singing Shango at the top of our lungs. And lo and behold, it turns out he probably actually heard me. Many, many, many years later, I found my way into many other traditions. It was really heathenry that brought me to Santeria in a very strange and roundabout way. Partly heathenry, partly my husband. I have always been a polytheist, and I have kind of personal relationships with my gods. And let's see, Jess started getting involved in some Orisha related work and convinced me that I should come with him, with me going, I'm really not looking for another tradition, but I guess I can come with you just to be supportive. And so I started going to things, and next thing I knew, I started having constant dreams that I was being struck by lightning, that this very handsome, very dark-skinned man with drums and dancing and a crown on his head was coming around and standing really close to me and saying, "Hi, we've met before. My name is Shango." And I'm going, "I'm a heathen, and this is strange. Odin, what do you think about this?" And Odin's like, "Woohoo, you're listening." And I'm like, "Oh, this is not good." So, so then at that point, the dreams were just getting so intense, and the relationship was I just felt like I had this very intense presence with me all the time. So I started seeking some help because this felt totally beyond my pay grade. Like it was a whole pantheon that I was not familiar with at all. It was an energy that I wasn't familiar with, and it was a very intense energy. I mean, I just felt like I had this very aggressive male energy with me, to the point where I was finding that my temper was up. I was hungry all the time. I was kind of aroused all the time. It was just this very intense chunk of time for me. So I started seeking out help. The first places that I went were more in the neo-pagan community, and I just was not finding anything that sounded credible at all. And so then I started trying to seek out traditional practitioners. And after kind of winding my way through a couple of leads, a friend of mine put me in touch with her padrino, Carlos Jimenez Babafunke, who is Santero in San Francisco. And I got a divination with him, and I got all kinds of information, and he knew all kinds of stuff that I hadn't told anybody before, and the divination was completely right on. And finally I was like, well, what's this thing about Shango though? And he's like, oh, just just take a bath in some milk and put some white flowers in the bathtub, and it'll cool everything off and you'll be fine. And I was like, oh, okay.
Okay.
But through all of that, we ended up getting involved in his house, mostly because, again, I was the one who got the first divination, but Jess was the one who really felt a very strong draw to all of this. He had kind of been searching anyway and felt like he had landed where he was looking. So then we started going to events, and I was there again as a, supportive wife and partner. Look at me go. And it was pretty early on. We'd only been to maybe 2 events at that point, that basically a medium mounted an Orisha, and the Orisha came over to me and said something like, "I am opening the way for you to initiate." And I was kind of going, "You're doing what? What does that even mean?" And then I basically ended up fast-tracked. I got lots and lots of confirmation from multiple divinatory sources. My own gods were really, really pushing me on this, that this is what they wanted for me, that I needed to be dual trad, that there was going to be stability and strength that I was going to be able to find in Santeria, that due to the kind of fragmented nature of the European traditions that I had been involved in up until then, basically what I would call sort of missing spirit tech, that there were things that they wanted me to be able to have and do that I just wasn't going to get from them. So they were basically sending me to another tradition to get those things. But also that was going to be a tradition with equal standing in my life. So it was about a year from when I first got my reading until I ended up being initiated as a priest in the religion. So, and here I am 4 years later, or pretty close to 4 years later.
Wow. That is pretty amazing. Although, like a lot of spiritual things, they just kind of end up falling in your lap. I know a lot of things.
When the spirits decide they're going to drop stuff in your lap, you're pretty much, fasten your seatbelt because here we go.
Right. Or drop you in somebody else's lap, for that matter.
As it were. Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
One thing about Santeria, which certainly is a true thing about it that is often difficult for folks who aren't familiar with these types of traditions to be comfortable with, mm-hmm. is that it is a tradition that is very, very largely dependent on divination. Mm-hmm. And the divinatory techniques are very, very old. And for folks within the tradition, we take them very seriously. Certainly, African and African-derived divinatory techniques are, in my experience, some of the most spot-on, reliably accurate divination techniques I've ever seen. And I've seen a lot of different types of divination techniques, including a lot of African and African-derived divination. And it's super spot on. So, we are very much guided by divination. When I walked into the religion, even as what I was thinking of as an outsider, I was basically told by a whole bunch of folks who knew what they were talking about that I walked in carrying all of the classic signs of somebody who was supposed to be a priest. And that's largely how the tradition works. For me, it was a year from start to initiation. I know other folks who have been in the tradition for, 10, 12 years and are not initiating. The spirits are, the Orisha aren't interested in them initiating. It's not the right thing for them. They've had that confirmed by divination. So in Santeria, even if you really want to initiate, if the Orisha say no, or if the spirits or the ancestors say no, then it's no. At mm-hmm. least as my house practices it. Every house is different, but that's how my house practices it. Whereas if the Orisha say, yes, this is really, really important, if you believe in the divinatory techniques, it's really up to the spirits to determine who initiates and who doesn't. If you really want to, even if you really want to, if the spirits say no, that's the answer. Mm-hmm. If it was, and often it's not necessarily your idea. Sometimes it is the spirits or the Orisha or the ancestors' idea to kind of bring you to the tradition to begin with. So that's kind of how it worked for me.
Well, we kind of, at least in our coven tradition, we kind of do that a bit, but mm-hmm. it's obviously not the same. But I find it interesting that, that there's a definite yes or no. Mm-hmm. I think that's rather fascinating. But you're not the first person that I've heard it from either, because I've known some other practitioners from the church that I go to, and, they've said similar things. So, mm-hmm. And I've always, like I said, I've always found it really fascinating because it just seems a very definite answer from the spirits.
Sometimes it is and sometimes it's not. I've seen situations where somebody really wanted to initiate, for whatever their personal reasons were. And the Orisha or the ancestors were kind of like, well, I guess if you really want to, but if you're going to, then here's a whole bunch of things you're going to need to do in order to make that possible. Mm. It does work that way sometimes,
Right.
But I've definitely seen it where the Orisha have consistently said, nope, 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 nope.
Well, I guess if anybody's going to know if you're doing the work or not, it'll be the spirits, right?
Exactly.
So, I know you probably have some things you can talk about and some things you can't. So, what are the rituals like? There's the Hollywoodized version.
Sure.
And then it's like, well, I know that's probably has a little grain of truth, but probably not a lot of grain of truth.
It depends on which movie you're talking about or which TV show.
Right.
I mean, as far as the rituals go, one thing to keep in mind about Santeria is that it is a syncretic. It's a syncretic religious / magical practice.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not. There's ways in which it is similar to other traditions or other religions, and then there's ways that it just isn't. In a large degree, Santeria specifically, and I'm only speaking about Santeria because there are many other African traditional and African derived religions that are not Santeria. But in Santeria, as my house practices it, as I've been taught by my elders, there's a level at which Santeria was kind of designed to nest comfortably within a Catholic framework, or at least alongside Catholicism, in a way that many people find to be complementary and not at all one against the other. What I have found in my personal practice, because I'm not Catholic, I'm not any flavor of Christian, and I never have been. I wasn't raised in any of those traditions at all. I have found, however, that because of the way that Santeria can be somewhat of a nesting tradition, that it nests comfortably alongside the other traditions that I've been involved with in that I practice. It fits beautifully alongside my ancestral tradition, which is Judaism, and it fits actually surprisingly very, very comfortably alongside my devotional polytheism as well.
Mm-hmm.
As far as so that's a bit of a lead in to say that as far as the rituals go, there are certain rituals that are somewhat what you might almost say standardized, but then many of the rituals are very, very personal and are kind of shaped specifically for the individual. There's a lot of ways in which you could say that Santeria is a tradition that is very focused on personal elevation or personal stability.
Right.
So it's kind of in a way a tradition that, how would I say this? That you would practice in order for your own elevation, but to have community support in doing that. So every individual person in the religion is going to have their own rules, their own requirements, their own taboos.
Mm-hmm.
There aren't necessarily universal taboos. There also aren't necessarily much in the way of universal requirements. There isn't even necessarily a whole lot in the way of universal morals, if that makes sense. It's not an immoral tradition, but it's somewhat of an amoral tradition. There are times where, somebody may be told that for their own benefit, they need to learn how to lie more. Like they tell the truth, they tell too much of the truth, and they're getting themselves in trouble by oversharing. And so sometimes they need to lie. Other people are told that they should never, ever, ever lie. There'll be dire consequences for them around lying. So the traditions, so the rituals themselves, there's many, many personal rituals that may be very, almost like not even, let me say it this way. Many of the individual rituals are personal prescriptions. The same way that you might go and get a diagnosis for an illness that you have, and you might be written an individual prescription for the specific condition that you have. Many of our personal rituals are personal prescriptions. So for whatever reason, your personal thing is that when you're not feeling well, you're best off wearing a lot of red clothing, and you should go and leave bananas under palm trees, but only wear the red clothing if you're not feeling well. You'll see these kinds of personal ritual prescriptions like that. There are certain rituals that we do in community. One type of ritual that we do in community is a tambor. I'm in a largely Spanish-speaking house, so we tend to use Spanish words for a lot of these things, although in some of the more African-leaning or Lukumi-leaning houses, tambor might also be known as a bembe, which is a drumming. It's a party, but it's a religious party. Often usually the way it works is there's live drumming, and the folks who gather to celebrate the Orisha sing and dance, and celebration happens that way. So those are probably the primary rituals I would say I could talk about. There's a lot of personal rituals that do get done. like I said, a lot of prescriptive rituals. A large amount of the prescriptive personal rituals are for cleansing.
Right.
Generally either for cleansing or for offerings, and often both.
Mm-hmm.
So you might be told that you need to bring 5 oranges to the river to honor Ochun, to do something nice for Ochun. Often you're told you need to clean yourself with those oranges. So you literally take the oranges and kind of rub them across your body to kind of get into your energy field, to remove whatever it is energetically that's not working for you, that you don't need, because it might be unwanted energy for you, but it's just formless, plain energy for them. And so then you give these kind of charged up oranges to the river, and then Ochun can take that energy and transform it. Either transform it to give you the thing that you were asking for, or to transform it for her own purposes. So there's a lot of that kind of stuff that you see in the religion. We don't really necessarily have, in a very unified way, a lot in terms of specific holidays.
Mm-hmm.
Often people kind of will go to their other religions for holidays. Some people do celebrate specific Orisha days, which may be associated with specific saint days in the Catholic calendar. Not everybody uniformly or universally celebrates those days, and they don't necessarily celebrate them in the same way either. Personal holidays, however, when you initiate, you now have your Santo birthday, and there are specific ritual things that you need to do every year in order to honor that day when you're birthed into the religion. The way that I've been taught it also, we consider the Santo birthdays of our direct elders to be somewhat of a holiday that we want to celebrate every year, and do certain specific ritualized nice things for our elders as well.
You also mentioned earlier about the house. What do you mean by house?
Santeria is generally organized in houses, also known as iles. Ile is a Lakumi word that basically means house. And the way that a house is organized, Santeria is a very, very hierarchical tradition. Mm-hmm. And the way that you become a priest is you have your padrino or your madrina, your godparent, is the one who will initiate you. In our house, everybody has a primary godparent, and then they have kind of what you might call like an assistant backup godparent known as a yubona. Mm-hmm. And so whoever does your initiation, that primary godparent, whoever else they personally have initiated, forms this kind of loose or tight community, depending on the group of people, that's known as a house or an ile. Some priests end up making a lot of godchildren, and then they may have kind of this community that they lead of folks that kind of were initiated by them, and then they often will celebrate together and do different kinds of stuff together as a community. Sometimes there's folks who maybe they may or may not still be working with that particular godparent, but they kind of come together because they get along well, or because they have godparents in common, even if the godparents themselves are no longer in the picture. And then they may end up practicing together in, again, either a loosely or a tightly knit kind of a community. In certain parts of the tradition, you'll see iles organized very, very tightly and somewhat formally. The part of the tradition that I'm in, it's a little bit more fluid, because my padrino and my madrina are actually and my yubona are from 2 different lineages. And so they get along really well. They do many things together, but they also have certain things that they do separately. So, I may go to activities at my padrino's house. I may go to separate activities with a semi-overlapping but somewhat distinct and separate community with my yubona. So, and then now that my partner and I are starting to kind of move forward in the religion, now we're starting to have our own godchildren as well. So, we'll kind of see what direction we decide to take the community in that way. But that's often how these things are organized.
Well, you're talking about the house and the makeup of everything. And, it's really the thing that's striking me, because we mentioned at the beginning that, so even some other neo-pagans are like, oh my God, Santeria. And, it sounds like a lot of other groups. I mean, it sounds that has some similarities to the way my coven works and the way I've been in other covens and other groups.
Mm-hmm.
So why do you think pagans are so weirded out?
Honestly, I mean, to not put too fine a point on it, some of it is straight up racism.
Uh-huh.
I mean,
Yeah.
again, most of the Santeria, most Santeria practitioners are either Latin American folks originating from Central or Latin American countries, or from Cuba specifically. Many of them are Spanish speakers, native Spanish speakers, or primary Spanish speakers. And then, there's also increasingly a large number of Santeria practitioners that are African American.
Mm-hmm.
And there has frequently been some amount of, how would I say it, friction, between traditional practitioners and primarily white pagans and neo-pagans who, how do I tend to have kind of grabby hands about other people's traditions and sacred technologies.
Right.
So partly, and this is the thing I've certainly seen a lot in the pagan community that I have very strong feelings about personally, but I know it's a complicated question.
Mm-hmm.
Which is that I know that there's a lot of folks who tend to kind of get very opinionated about there should never be any secrets and knowledge is free and we should all have access to knowledge and this, that, and the other thing, which is very in conflict with Santeria, where we're a mystery tradition.
Mm-hmm.
If you haven't been initiated, there's things that you simply are never going to be told by an ethical practitioner. I mean, these days, obviously, with the internet and everything else, it's not that hard to find information, although whether that information is credible is a different question.
Yeah.
But, honestly, there's the secrecy thing, and we guard our secrets pretty carefully for a lot of reasons. Some of it is because of ritual technology reasons. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in Santeria, if you're going through a ceremony for the first time, even if it's your own ceremony, like if you're getting a specific personal elevation or a certain type of an initiation, if you've never gone through that ceremony before, you go through it with your eyes closed,
Right.
even if it's your own ceremony, because you've never participated in it before. So you're not allowed to see it, even though it's being done for you.
Mm-hmm.
The first time that you get to see certain ceremonies is after you've already gone through it, if you're helping somebody else to get that elevation or to do that initiation. We really guard our secrets carefully. And some of that is because we do have a belief that certain things are just not going to land in the right way if you haven't already gone through the initiatory process to basically have the spirit tech installed.
Mm-hmm.
Because then it's just words. It's just, it's information, but you don't have a felt sense or lived sense experience of it. I was actually really glad when I was initiated that I didn't know anything about what to expect, because it meant that for me, I could walk into it like with total beginner mind, and everything was brand new and everything was a surprise. And I was able to stay really cleanly in kind of a present moment, authentic reaction to the experience. But I know a lot of neo-pagans get really uncomfortable. How dare you not give me access to this information? Well, why do you want it? Well, because I do. Because,
Well,
I've had arguments with folks about this quite a bit.
Yeah, I can imagine. And, I've been of the, the secrets seem silly to me kind of thing. But there's a big, huge but here, is that, I have to respect your tradition.
Mm-hmm.
If a tradition has specific secrets or specific things that it needs to hold back, it's the way the tradition works. And if it's not my tradition, then, I could read whatever I want, but, I'm not going to fully understand it unless I go and practice it. So either I read about it and just think of it as information that is interesting, or if I really felt a call to learn about it, I would talk to you or some of the other people that I knew and be like, hey, you know, I've been thinking about this. Can I get more information from you? And then, you know, see where the process goes. But, you know, doing it with respect, doing it by respecting
Absolutely,
the tradition.
absolutely. I mean, but you know, there's another piece that absolutely is important to say here too about the nature of the secrets, which
Mhm.
is that honestly, I look around at my community, and you know, a lot of my practice, a lot of the community that I practice with are folks who, um, you know, some of whom are that they're immigrants to this country, many of whom are working class, many of whom um, do actually run the risk of losing their jobs
Right.
if folks found out that they were practicing a religion that they're not comfortable with. I mean, there's real vulnerability in our community as well. We have some folks in the community who are illegal, where there would potentially be really major repercussions if it came out that they were involved in the tradition. So, you know, some of the secrets are about protecting our community, which
Mm-hmm.
a lot of the community that I'm in are folks who have a little bit greater level of vulnerability than many of the neo-pagan white middle class neo-pagan folks that I often kind of interact with in the broader pagan community here in the Bay Area. Um, you know, so there's that piece too, you know.
Right. Absolutely. And and it brings up the difference between, you know, what is a tradition secret and then the privacy
Mm-hmm.
and confidentiality of the group that you practice with.
Yep. And honestly, there are a bunch of things that we do in Santeria that make many practitioners who, you know, many folks who haven't been raised in these types of communities where this sort of thing is done very uncomfortable. You
Mm-hmm.
know, things that I can say, um, you know, for one thing, I mean, let's air the elephant in the room. We do practice animal sacrifice, and that
Mm-hmm.
does make a lot of folks very, very uncomfortable.
Right.
Um, in my experience of being in the tradition, I find that the sacrifices are done, generally speaking, very, very cleanly, very humanely. I would rather an animal be killed with utmost respect and reverence and quickly and cleanly, where I get to be there to hold space while that happens, versus like, I don't know what in the heck happened to get me a hamburger. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, but animal sacrifice is a very, very controversial subject and makes a lot of folks really uncomfortable.
Yeah.
So there's definitely that piece. Another piece also is that in Santeria, everything is for cost. You know, rituals cost money, elevations cost money, divinations cost money. Sometimes even lessons cost money, depending on the practitioner. And I know that in certain parts of the broader pagan community, money is viewed with a whole lot of judgment and disrespect. And I've certainly, you know, in the 20 plus years I've been in the pagan community, I've heard a lot of folks basically giving as a warning, well, you know, anybody who would charge you money for a ritual is obviously a fraud and a charlatan, and you should stay away from them altogether. You know, in our community, for one thing, when we're doing these kinds of rituals, often it involves a whole lot of actual supplies that somebody has to pay for them.
Right.
It involves time. It involves, I mean, there are certain ceremonies we'll do where we have to fly somebody in from Florida, you know, or Los Angeles in order to have them do the ceremony because they hold certain skills or knowledge that we don't have in our local community. You know, if you're hiring drummers, they're not just going to drum for your party because it's fun. These are professionals, you
Right.
know. So the fact that there's a money exchange that happens. Also, we believe that, you know, everything's done on exchanges. You know, money is certainly a type of exchange. It's a way for us to say, I respect you. I respect your expertise. I respect your skills. I respect your time. And I respect your crown. You know, that's how we talk about being a priest, is that you're crowned to an orisha. So it's a way to say, I'm not just respecting you, the person, I'm respecting the orisha who you're crowned to. And I'm doing so financially. I'm doing so by, you know, washing your dishes. Since I'm at your house anyway, I'm doing so by bringing offerings or whatever it is.
Now, you know, I'm kind of on the fence about money, and my thought has evolved over the years. And suffice to say, you know, it's like, if you can do, if you don't, whatever. You know, it depends on who you are, what your tradition is, what you want to do with your life.
Absolutely.
So I'm kind of like, you know, you're the boss of your own underpants, right?
I love that. That's perfect. And yes.
Yeah. But, you know, divination, and like I just said about the animal sacrifices, like, you know, I know maybe it's just because I've had more exposure to people who are in your tradition or in various, I guess, denominations is the only word I'm thinking of at the moment. Sure. Iterations,
that
whatever,
works.
Of the tradition, the different traditions within the tradition. But, you know, I don't know. I guess it's never really seemed scary to me. I've been more curious about Santeria than not. So it's never seemed ooga booga to me. So I guess maybe that's why I'm kind of like, you know, there's a part of me that, like, if something's not ooga booga to me, I'm kind of like, well, why are you freaking out?
Right. I agree. I agree. I mean, one thing I have seen happen on occasion that also seems to sometimes make folks, this is going to be a weird one to say, but I'm going to say it anyway because I've observed it. I think that not all, so much of this really depends. When you're using the phrase pagan or neo-pagan, I mean, I don't even want to start unpacking that right now because we'll be here all night.
Right.
You know, I mean, that word to some degree is such a broad umbrella term that to some degree, you can make an argument that it functionally means nothing at this point.
Yeah.
It's not that it means nothing. It's just that it's really hard to say what it means without really unpacking it or getting more specific about what you mean with regard to your own stuff.
Right.
While there are certainly many neo-pagans who are practicing traditions, there are also many who really, really value independence and being able to be very fluid and flexible in their work. And I mean, I'm not actually criticizing any of this one way or another. There are certain places in my own spiritual practices where that innovation is so mandatory and really feeds my soul. Within the context of Santeria, it's a tradition. And there are very specific places where you don't really have the leeway to kind of throw it up in the air and make it up as you go along.
Right.
You know, some of this is what I would call very old spiritual technologies, where these are tried and true methods that folks have been using for a pretty long time that have been shown to get the desired spiritual outcome that you're looking for, you know, whatever that specific spiritual outcome might be. So, you know, it's not like you're going to go, hey, I mean, I know that like this has been pretty cool so far, but like, let's just kind of mix it up a little. Let's throw in a deity from another country, or let's throw in a concept from another tradition, or I know we're going to do a song and dance number in the middle of this just because that sounds like fun, you know?
Right.
Like, Santeria is not really the place for that kind of total freeform innovation. And there are definitely certain, I mean, I've spoken with certain folks within the broader pagan community who get very kind of huffy if you tell them that they kind of have to stick to the script.
Right.
You know, which means that it's not a tradition for everyone. Nothing is for everyone. And certainly Santeria is not for everyone. Again, there's no judgment here, right? There's no right or wrong here, but within the context of the tradition, if what you're going to do is Santeria, then you're using the Santeria framework, you're using the Santeria theology, you're using the underlying understandings of how the world works, you're very much leaning on respectful interactions with the ancestors, and the ancestors are very much considered to be active living participants. Right. You know, this is not conceptual. These are real entities who have opinions and make their opinions known, and who we create very specific containers for so that they can participate in their own very specific ways. Right. So we can't just throw things around and mix things up just because we feel like it, because that disrupts the flow of a living tradition that is a pretty in-depth one. And, you know, I've known people in the broader pagan community who really value their ability to be very in the moment and very creative and innovative in their work, where Santeria just doesn't work for them because it's too strict. It's too structured, you know?
Right. But I also see that, you know, you've got your Brit trads that are pretty strict and hierarchical, and OTO and Golden Dawn. I guess it comes around again where it's kind of like, I guess being somebody who does a lot of interfaith work anyway, there's got to come a point where first you got to respect somebody's tradition, and also realize that, it may not be for you. Even if one of the deities comes knocking on your door.
Exactly. And you know what? I mean, the thing with Santeria too is that there very, very much is a very broad place where lay practitioners there's open invitation for lay practitioners to have their own personal relationships with Orisha if that's what they're feeling called to. You don't have to initiate. You don't have to join a house. You don't have to do any of these things. Right. And I mean, I know some really wonderful folks who have very deep devotional relationships with individual Orishas or with Orisha as a whole, who are not Santeria practitioners. They're not involved in any kind of, formal tradition, but, they keep their little shrines. They have their candles, they do their devotions in the way that they see fit. And there's absolute invitation and room for that,
And that's cool. But I also think, and I've mentioned this to other people before too. And I guess I'm kind of sounding like a little bit of a broken record, is about, respecting the tradition. If a particular deity comes knocking at my door, I want to go find out the stories and the rituals and like the stories and what's been said about this particular deity, what people do for this particular deity. And I mean, I think that's the way to honor the tradition, even if you're working with something. So it's, it's kind of, people talk a lot about cultural appropriation. And I think, we kind of all appropriate from each other, but there's respectful ways of doing it and really crappy ways of doing it.
Sure. And honestly, I mean, I sat really intensely with those questions when the Orisha really first started coming knocking because, I kind of said to the gods I was working with and to the Orisha who were coming courting, I'm a Jewish chick from Long Island.
Right.
Are you sure you're knocking on the right door?
Yeah.
Like, blessings, love, and respect. Like, how does this all fit together? And the answer that I got is, it's about the tradition. It's about becoming an ancestor of the tradition. It's about, becoming part of the lineage. There's respectful ways to do that. As far as I'm concerned, I am proud of my crown and I'm proud of my place in the broader tradition. My initiation was a very traditional one. All of the things that were done, I would be, I would be recognized as a legitimate practitioner by most anyone who's involved in the tradition who knows the right questions to ask. All of that being said, I also always try to respectfully stand in privilege and awareness of some of the broader complexities and the intersectionality questions around all this stuff. Right. The truth is that I do still have certain privileges that many other folks in my community just don't have.
Right.
I'm a native English speaker. I was born in the United States. I have light skin privilege. There's a bunch of that kind of stuff. And I do feel like there's a really key respect piece for me in honoring and respecting that as the lived experience of my community, and also in respecting the fact that that Orisha and the tradition itself originates out of Africa, and the relationship between Africa and the United States is complicated and ugly. Yes. So I don't personally consider what I'm doing to be any kind of cultural appropriation, specifically because when these powers came calling, I did my very best to try and go through the tradition in the most traditional way possible, and really allowing myself to be shaped and guided by my elders in the tradition. And Santeria has always had openness to it doesn't matter what your skin color is. It doesn't matter what your blood is. It matters where your heart is and what you're doing within the tradition. it's very much a tradition where there's openness to folks. One of the things my elders always say is the Orisha are for everyone. The Orisha are for everyone. The Orisha are for everyone, but the tradition still has context that needs to be held and honored. But if the tradition is being held and honored in context, then it's, for Santeria specifically, I don't think of it as cultural appropriation. If somebody were to just kind of waltz in and go, hey, I like this particular Orisha, I'm just going to kind of grab them and paste them into the thing I'm doing and not really respect the practitioners and not really bother getting to know the Orisha. I've just decided to kind of slap their images or their name on top of something that I've already decided I'm doing anyway. That's where you start getting into cultural appropriation.
Yeah.
When or even as a traditional practitioner, if you walk in and you're like, I'm going to create a whole bunch of exotifying nonsense around, being a white person in a primarily Spanish speaking community. It's like, don't do that. That's just not cool.
Yeah.
Or I'm going to be really exotifying around the fact that I'm working within an African context. It's like, no, don't do that.
Right.
But the fact of being somebody not born to the tradition, but still being involved in the tradition within specifically the context of Santeria, I don't think is cultural appropriation necessarily. And generally, from other traditional practitioners that I've spoken to about this, that seems to generally be the consensus in the communities I move through.
Mm-hmm.
But, the way that I could also, a comparison that I could make here as well is, I was born Jewish. I still identify as Jewish. For me, my Judaism is very much a cultural thing. I'm a second generation American citizen, second generation born in the US.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, a lot of my Judaism very much is cultural, but it's also religious. So anybody who would convert to Judaism, I would absolutely give the exact same level of respect and deference, as any other Jew. But if that person were to then start making offensive jokes about matzo balls and speaking in a really obnoxious fake Yiddish accent, I might raise an eyebrow and be like, really? What are you doing?
Yeah.
So it's like, how do we both stand in respecting the religion while also being aware of some of the cultural overtones and where we have access and right and where we need to tread carefully and respectfully.
Right. So I think that's a lesson that a lot of people could learn. And I'm saying this in a general way, that a lot of white Americans could learn about being in sacred space and respecting other people in general, but religious tradition in particular.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
Because, it's not really learned, and not a lot of people have a lot of experience being in sacred space, or, if they do, it's more of, they've been dragged to church and find it really boring. And, it's just kind of like, yeah, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So, learning to respect sacred space and honor sacred space, I think would be an important lesson to learn, but, how to teach everybody in the United States, I don't know.
Yeah, from your mouth to the ears of the gods.
Right. So we're just about out of time. So if people would like to get in touch with you to ask questions, what would be the best way to go about that?
I can be found on Facebook as River Devora, or you can email me at river.devora, that's DEVORA, @gmail.com.
All right. And we'll have that in the show notes. And thank you very much. Even though we've had a lot of issues with Skype, we seem to have managed to get through it.
Excellent.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. This was fun.
I'd like to thank River for joining us this week. As always, if you have comments, questions, or would like to read the show notes, you can go to thisweekinheresy.com. You can support This Week in Heresy by subscribing to the show via iTunes or the Stitcher app, following us on Twitter at TWIH Podcast, or financially through Patreon. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you next time.